ahead of this year's World Confectionery Conference. We catch up with Jon Walker, Senior Cocoa Advisor with Fairtrade, to discuss how the movement is tackling key issues including child labour, deforestation and using technology to drive impact and change for farmers on the ground in West Africa. Here we go.
Thanks, Neil. Well, as you say, we spoke a year ago and I was listening back to the recording of that just the other day. And at that point, you said to me, what is the impact and the situation for the price of cocoa farmers in West Africa 12 months ago? Now, I said it was a disaster at that point. 12 months later, it shifted a bit, but we're still 18% below the price of cocoa in 2016. And of course, now we're in the grip of a global inflation crisis. And that is going to be hitting cocoa farmers in West Africa. So really deeply concerned about that. And if you think about it, the rate of inflation in Ghana is just over 27%. The rate of inflation in Côte d'Ivoire is 5.5%. A lot lower because it's tied to the euro, but Eurozone has inflation rate prediction of 8.1%. So there's every likelihood that will go higher. So we've got cost of living increasing. We've got fertilizers doubling in price over the last year, or raising from 100% to 200% in price over the last year. So the cost of production is increasing at the same time as the cost of living for these cocoa farmers. This could manifest itself in really very, very bad circumstances for them.
Now, this is concerning to hear that, because obviously we've had the pandemic over the past couple of years. So from your perspective, how do you feel that has impacted on farming operations in West Africa?
Well, I think as we've come out of the pandemic, we've gone into this inflation crisis, haven't we? And, if we think about how this might impact farmers, as your cost of production goes up and your cost of living goes up, then you're faced with some really uncomfortable situations. First is that food insecurity will go up, and that will result in increased malnutrition, increased hunger. The second is, as those household incomes come under pressure, people have to make some really uncomfortable choices. And we know from the research from our colleagues at the International Cocoa Initiative that shocks to household income can have impacts on child labour. So, we really are we've come out of the pandemic, or we have to a certain extent, and thank goodness for that. But really, we've entered into another really serious situation.
Highlighting that, but from your perspective, how can Fairtrade position itself to try and rebalance the situation there in West Africa?
At a basic level, if a ton of cocoa from Côte d'Ivoire is sold on fair trade terms, then that farmer receives, or the farmers receive, an extra 15% on the farm gate price compared to conventional. So that's an immediate way. There's also a fair trade premium of $240 per tonne. That goes to the cooperative, and the cooperative then decides at General Assembly how to use that. And we see from the years we've been working this on in the past that cooperatives will step in and they'll assist with the cost of fertilizers, the cost of other inputs, they'll assist with income diversification, and during the pandemic they even assisted with food relief. So we have those basic structures within Fairtrade. Now, regrettably, only 40% of Fairtrade cocoa is sold on Fairtrade produced cocoa is sold on Fairtrade terms. So we need to up that percentage so that more farmers who are Fairtrade certified get more benefits that are inherent when brands and retailers buy on Fairtrade terms. The second thing we need to do is we need to move more quickly towards living income. So progress has been made in the past. This cost of living crisis could well, pull that progress back. We are working with some fantastic partners, Ben & Jerry's, Tony's, Riva, Lidl, Chocolate Halber, and now Mars, all of whom are going beyond fair trade terms and working in partnership with us on a combination of interventions such as diversification, access to finance, increased farm efficiency, and even more payments to farmers. So that's fantastic that we have that in place. What we really need now, Neil, is not just what fair trade does, but system change.
Point indeed, and I've just come back from the Chocoa event in Amsterdam that looks at these very kind of issues, and they had Michel Arion of the ICCO speaking remotely there, and his key point, the takeaway there, was that he would like to see the price of cocoa raised by at least by a factor of 3 in order to try and attain this living wage for farmers. Would you believe that that's somewhere around the mark? Do you feel that would be fair to farmers?
Yeah, well, we have a living income reference price, which I think is something like 2.5 times the current farm gate price. So we're fairly aligned with where Michel is saying he seems the needed price to get to. You know, and I think one of the things, or kind of the rays of hope that are out there, is that this discussion is becoming more normalized within the industry. We have recently the World Business Council for Sustainable Development launched Business Commission to tackle inequality, and they recognise themselves the need for respect for human rights, distribute value and risk equitably, which includes purchasing practices and the need for living income, or living wages as they put it, and that you can't tackle climate change without tackling inequality. So we've got business making this shift. We've also got sustainability moving from voluntary to regulatory, with the European Commission's proposals on human rights and environmental due diligence directive, and also the deforestation regulation proposal. So there is this shift. There needs to be improvement in that regulation for it actually to be effective before it comes into law, but there is a shift going on. Well, these things could be game changers, right? Because we move from voluntary sustainability, as you're saying, to mandatory sustainability. I mean, there are some things that need to change in these regulations. So for them to be effective, for the HREDD proposals to be effective, recently 270 Fairtrade certified workers' organisations and cooperatives, along with 40 companies, including people like Tony's, etc., wrote to the European Commission and said, look, this needs to cover the whole supply chain, not just part of the supply chain. The costs of compliance can't be dumped on the weakest in the supply chain, on farmers. There needs to be long-term commitments, including purchasing practices and programs to enable living income. And there needs to be partnerships between businesses and farmers to address the most serious human rights abuses, and we don't get into a situation where it's just cut and run. So this is possible that we achieve these changes because the directive is still in dialogue. And similarly for the deforestation regulation, I mean, that's a bit different because they proposed that rather as a policing regulation. They're policing how cocoa comes into Europe, or conditions under which it's grown in relation to deforestation. And again, we along with 50 other organisations have written to the Commission and saying, look, we support this, but there needs to be some changes. And the critical things that need to change is that we need to ensure that farmers have the tools for compliance, and that there needs to be allowance made for farmers, or provision made for farmers who have legally deforested after the proposed cut-off date of December 2020, but would have their access to market restricted under the new regulation. So those things need to change, and are practical things we can do, but the way the Commission can change that is by immediately doing an impact assessment on smallholders, so to ensure the regulation is fit for purpose.
Excellent. And a topic you mentioned there regarding child labour, which has sadly been ever present. And since our last conversation a year ago, I know Fairtrade has been working hard to try and play its part, but how concerned are you by the fact that we still have a situation where there's 1.5 million children exposed to child labour there in West Africa at present?
Well, yeah, obviously deeply concerned, Neil, and really where we need to shift is we need to increase the income of farmers, and that's why these programs on living income and linking living income to regulation, the sustainability moves from voluntary to regulatory. That's why this is so important, because it's only when families can access their human rights So affordable housing, food, access to education, access to water, that you can start to tackle some of these issues. Now there are other issues surrounding child labour, such as school infrastructure, but poverty clearly is one of the issues.
So is that again a cause for concern that measures that are being brought in are being affected by rapid events on the ground?
Well, you know, we see this immediately at Fairtrade as well, because we have a Fairtrade minimum price. So when the living income differential was introduced in October 2020, there was no Fairtrade minimum price differential for cocoa farmers because the price of cocoa rose. Then immediately after that season, it dropped back down again and has continued to stay below the Fairtrade minimum price. So we absolutely see that, and of course that's a concern, Neil, because we don't want the Fairtrade minimum price to be active. We want all farmers to be receiving a better price.
Indeed, and just coming back to the core mission of your work here, can you just explain to your mind, you know, how important it is, the work that Fairtrade is doing on the ground? They're trying to provide a better deal for farmers.
Well, you know, there are a number of really exciting projects that we're working on, Neil. There's the living income projects that I was describing to you earlier with our project partners. The other piece of work that I'm really finding incredibly interesting at the moment is the work that we're doing on practical measures to try and ensure that cocoa farmers who are Fairtrade certified continue to have access to the European market as all this new regulation comes in. And we're working with some fantastic partners in that on projects, two projects. The first is access for cooperatives to digital management systems, and the second is access to cooperatives and farmers for deforestation satellite information.
Just coming back to yourself here on a personal level, what keeps you passionate about driving the cause of trying to support these key communities?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Neil. I mean, on a personal level, as long as I still feel that I'm making a difference and relevant, and the way that seems to manifest itself is involvement in these living income projects, is involvement in these access to digital management systems and access to deforestation data projects, which will define market access in the future for cooperatives. And you know, I think the final one that really inspires me and keeps me going is for about 5 years now, we've been running a women's school of leadership in Côte d'Ivoire with Fairtrade Africa, and with support of commercial partners and with donors. And over those 5 years, we've raised 1.5 million euros to implement this. Fairtrade Africa have graduated hundreds of students through this Women's School of Leadership. They've gone on to impact the lives of thousands of people. And just at the end of last year, they have a graduation ceremony every year. And at the end of last year, the Ivorian government committed to support that cohort's graduation's income generating activities, and that was just this fantastic thing for the Ivorian government to do, to step in and give some support, and also hugely symbolic for us that the Ivorian government had followed the progress of this project over time, and then at graduation ceremony stepped forward and said, yes, we believe in this and we want to support it. So I think it's things like these changes that we can see happening through our work that really motivate me.